It's wonderful to be here, and it's great to see you all. One of the things that we have to grapple with when we're dealing with Wagner is that he is probably the single most influential composer, certainly of the 19th century. There's really Beethoven and Wagner. And I'm wearing this Mahler shirt for a particular reason. Mahler is one of the composers who would probably have developed just fine as a composer, but perhaps differently had it not been for Wagner. And also because Mahler was an opera conductor, an excellent one, and he was a champion of Wagner's operas, and he was insistent in both Vienna and New York on restoring them to their uncut versions. And keep in mind, this was only 25 years after The Ring premiered. It had become a sort of habit to shorten them, to make cuts in them, and Mahler would have none of that. So when we think of the length of Wagner's operas, and usually that's the first thing people talk about when they talk about Wagner. Oh my God, they're 5 hours long. That's not that much longer than Gone with the Wind. So I think we'll be able to manage. And I don't know whether you've looked on the website or anybody has said, yes, this is an opera in 3 acts. And the acts are lengthy, but there are 30-minute intermissions. There are 2 intermissions, each of which will be 30 minutes, and the evening starts at 6. Now, I think this is a fantastic idea, and anybody else who's waited in line for the restrooms during an intermission at the Royal Theatre knows that a half an hour is not too long to make sure everybody gets a chance. Anyway, Wagner is also a composer who is more written about than any other composer. There's almost no contest, even today. He's also a composer who wrote more prose than anybody else. So he's very much in the center of our universe in the field of opera, or as he would have called it, music drama. Let's look at the year he was born, because it was a world then that we don't particularly really have anymore. Wagner was born in 1813. That is the same year that Verdi was born. And they are the twin peaks of 19th century opera in the Italian world and then in the German one. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But only 2 years earlier than that, Franz Liszt was born. And around that time in the late noughts and early teens, we have Chopin, we have Schumann, we have Mendelssohn, all of these composers arriving, and only a few years earlier than that, Hector Berlioz. So this was an incredible time for creative, enterprising, and innovative composers to exist. And they create a world in which the abyss, shall we call it, between the average concert goer and the sophisticated appreciator of what we might call high classical music was much smaller than it is today. So Wagner was a thing, at least he became one. So he was born into a cultured family. His stepfather definitely introduced him to theater and to literature, and he grew into music very much as a self-taught musician. He had a few lessons which he described rather disparagingly. Wagner could be very disparaging. We're talking about him as a great artist. He was not the most comfortable of human beings to be around. Neither was Verdi, to be honest. Neither was Beethoven. We could make the list. There's probably more that we'd like to avoid than that we'd like to socialize with. In any case, when I say he was self-taught, I want to tell you I believe all great composers are self-taught. If they go to school, they learn some of the basics, the way James Joyce might have learned English in primary school. But they become the unique artists that they become because of their own work, their own thought, and their own efforts. So Wagner taught himself everything and then continued to push through that envelope. He was not a particularly employable person at first. He did a lot of sort of Joe jobs, as we might call them. Conducting gigs he really didn't appreciate. He wrote a great deal of music criticism and music articles. And he wrote things like piano sonatas and symphonies that we don't even hear them anymore. His first opera, I don't think, was ever produced. So it took him a while to get on his feet, let's say. He was no Mozart in that regard. He also was a bit of a self-saboteur. If you remember Lorenzo da Ponte, Wagner was very much like that. First of all, he got into scrapes because he couldn't keep his hands off ladies, especially if they were married to somebody else. He did get himself involved with a soprano named Wilhelmina Planer, who was no prodigy of mental stability, it would seem, and who had she enjoyed habits of promiscuity herself, and they got married. Then they separated, then they got back together, then they separated, then they got back together. He had mistresses, she had lovers, but they remained legally married until she died. I'm going to talk a little bit more about Wagner's private life as we go on, because I think you'll find it amusing. Now, he was able to begin to get some work, and he was given the job of music director at an opera house in Riga, in Latvia. So Mina and Richard went to Latvia. Now, they had to leave under cover of darkness because of one of Wagner's other vices, which is he would run up bills everywhere in town and not pay them. One of my favorite anecdotes, I'm sure this wouldn't have been the favorite anecdotes of the creditor, but had Wagner had an engagement, had a professional engagement, and when he received his paycheck, he didn't go and begin paying back all his bills. He bought himself a nice new ermine coat. So this is a sense of entitlement. So he and Mina booked themselves on a boat trip that was to take them to Paris via London. And it turned out to be a very stormy and turbulent trip. And this gave him the sort of germ of inspiration for what we must call his first immortal opera. And this is, of course, The Flying Dutchman. Now, I want to ask a series of questions now. The first one is, has anybody seen The Flying Dutchman? Good, because Pacific Opera's done it twice. Now, before The Flying Dutchman, we have an opera that would have been Wagner's biggest hit during his own lifetime, and that is called Rienzi. Now, has anybody seen Rienzi? One person has. Two people have. Most of the rest of us haven't had an opportunity to, because it doesn't get produced very often today. But it was the most frequently produced of Wagner's works during his own lifetime, not excluding the years of The Ring and Tristan. He disowned it. More about that later. So he was beginning to have some success in the opera house, but then he changed his whole approach to the production of this material. And he found himself in Dresden. I'm going to mention now somebody who was of enormous assistance to Wagner in getting himself placed on the operatic map and recognized by the discerning members of the public, and that is Franz Liszt. The great pianist, great composer, great teacher, and great conductor, who personally made sure that Wagner's works like Tannhäuser and Flying Dutchman got presented, and he gave Wagner work. Now, Wagner was also very interested in philosophy, as I said, literature and the theater, and also politics. He was what we would call a lefty or a pinko, at a time when this is becoming somewhat risky. And he was involved in the events that we associate with the 1848 revolution to a degree that he was associating with people considered very dangerous by the government, keeping in mind that there is no unified Germany yet. And just these associations, possibly exacerbated by what Wagner wrote in terms of political pamphleteering, found him with an arrest warrant in his name. Now, a couple of his associates were actually executed. They were put to death. So this was pretty risky. So again, like Lorenzo da Ponte, he had to get himself out of Germany. Lorenzo had to get himself out of Italy. So between 1848, and 1858, Wagner finds himself in exile. And he's mostly stationed in the Swiss city of Zurich with Mina. And he begins to write a series of polemical articles that are still read and consulted today. And these include something that I'll just mention in passing when we conclude our look at this, the Jew in music, or Judaism in music. His already fairly natural, fairly inborn anti-Semitism, which was mirrored by all Germanic-speaking people in Austria as well as in Germany, kind of hardened a little bit. But it also includes some very valuable insights into what he believed belonged on the lyric stage. If he had an anti-Italian sentiment, this was also hardened a little bit, because he had seen works that he considered inferior to his own, which probably included almost everything. He was no stranger to megalomania either. He saw these succeed. He saw them have a public. He saw those composers make money, and he wondered why nobody was interested in his work. So, more about that later as well. So these polemics are actually worth reading, but I'm going to crystallize some of the material down for you a little bit. And then he began in 1851 to work on a project that had been close to his heart for a few years. It began with telling the story musically of Siegfried's death. Siegfried, a hero from the medieval epic poem, the Nibelungenlied, or the Song of the Nibelungens. Then he began, the inspiration just grew, and he began to put together what is called a tetralogy. What that is, it's derived from Greek drama, is 3 lengthy, didactic, morally edifying works of theater that are preceded by a shorter prelude. Now, that it should immediately bring to mind Lord of the Rings, because I'll tell you, Tolkien knew his Wagner. But this will become, of course, the Ring of the Nibelungen. And the prelude, the shorter prelude, was mounted by Pacific Opera 10 years ago. It's called Das Rheingold, or the Gold of the Rhine. And since it's so short, 2 hours and 45 minutes, it's given without an intermission. And the rest of them are, as we usually clock them, around 4 hours and a bit. And they are Die Walküre, which is not only the first of the big evenings, it's the first one that was produced live in front of an audience. And then Siegfried, the great hero, and then Götterdämmerung, the Twilight of the Gods. I have a little story to tell you about that a little bit later. Now, this ultimately will be premiered as a whole complete tetralogy in 1876. So from putting pen to paper, I don't know when he first had the idea, I imagine when he was a child, but from putting pen to paper to actually bringing it into a hall took 25 years. It wasn't at all unbroken, however, because at some point, even so self-confident an artist as Wagner must have looked at what he was asking. He was asking for huge casts, asking for huger orchestras, the resources in terms of scenery and technology that were beyond any opera house currently working and operating in Europe. And he must have looked at this and realized he was squandering his time. No one was ever going to put these on. So he put them away in mid-Siegfried and turned his attention to something else. Now I'm going to tell you about some other people he was familiar with, in some ways intimate with, during his exile in Zurich. And he was helped out because, of course, he had very little in the way of employment. He was helped out by a wealthy industrialist named Otto Wesendonck. And Otto Wesendonck not only gave him money to live on and to support Mina, but he also ultimately gave them a cottage on his property to live in, rent-free, of course. And Wagner repaid him by having an affair with his wife, Matilda. And Matilda was a poet. She wrote the texts that became almost Wagner's only lieder, his only German art song, and they are now referred to as the Wesendonck lieder. And they exist in versions for piano and voice as well as orchestra and voice. And they were given in concert on the Wesendonck property. And in the room, listening to them, among others, of course, were Mrs. Wagner, Mina Planer, Mrs. Wesendonck, Matilda Wesendonck, the poet and the lover of the composer, and Cosima Liszt von Bülow, one of Liszt's children by his own mistress, Countess Marie d'Agoult, who would grow, not that many years later, she would grow an intense affection for Wagner and dump her husband and children and move in with him while Mina was still alive. Now, I want to just point out an irony. Most of Wagner's operas are about the purifying effect, the redeeming effect of an imperfect man in the platonic love of an idealized woman. So none of these are autobiographical anyway. So what happens now is that Wagner took these lieder and called them Studies for Tristan und Isolde, and he turned his attention now to this masterwork. And I want to play you the opening of Tristan. How many of you have seen Tristan und Isolde in a live performance? There, we get to see that much more often than we get to see Rienzi, and that's okay. Now, if we were living 130 years ago, the opening prelude of Tristan would be in our minds and in our consciousness if we were at all interested in music. And it's said that this changed music. This opened the doors to modern music. So it behooves me to play some of it for you. Now that's just this little thing making noise, right? It's not my knees. Now, we'll be talking a little bit about Wagner's musical language, and this is a perfect little précis of it. Wagner wanted to create a language which allowed for what he called continuous melody, and that avoids what I would call the perfect cadence or the full stop. We hear virtually, we never hear that in Wagner. He wanted to be able to write long, long lines. And that meant he cultivated the use of chromatic harmony, which avoids chords like I just played, to the nth degree. So this is the opening passage from Tristan und Isolde, and it actually brought to the public's attention what is sometimes called the Tristan chord. Now that passage is essentially in the key of A minor. Now I'm going to play A minor chord. That sounds out of place in the midst of all that dissonance and chromaticism. And that's Wagner's language, and it continues throughout the entire work. There certainly are cadences, there certainly are what we would call major triads, but we have to go through an awful lot of dissonance and chromaticism to get to them. So that basically changes the face of music. And I'm going to tell you one other thing, and you may forget it as soon as I've said it if you wish. But one of the things that this brings up is a device in tonal music known as chromatic saturation. And that's when we hear all of the 12 tones in the chromatic octave within a very short period, like a bar or a phrase. And that's what happened with this. All of them are presented in that order. And that produces what will ultimately be called in music history a tone row. So I now have to ask you, has anybody enjoyed the music of Schoenberg at any point of your life? You have enjoyed it. I'm very happy to see that, because many people have heard it and few have enjoyed it. But without Wagner, there would be no Schoenberg in anything like the same sense that we think of it today. Okay. So we'll put Tristan to rest now. And focus a little bit more now on some of the other things that happened in exile that are really going to excite us. The next thing is that he and Mina had a real bad falling out, and Wagner got out of Zurich and ended up for a while in Paris, where he had his work Tannhäuser presented. Now, has anybody studied the history of Paris Grand Opera at any point? Because Pacific Opera doesn't produce that. And one of the reasons is that you need a corps de ballet to actually pull off a French grand opera. And so any composer wanting to have a hit in France had to put a ballet into the opera. So Verdi did it in Don Carlos, and Wagner did it in Tannhäuser. Now, this was not a complete abject fiasco, the way some historians have reported it. It did have some positive feedback. And the effort to get an audience into the theater to see Wagner's Tannhäuser was spearheaded by the mega successful composer Giacomo Meyerbeer. That's not a household name anymore, but it certainly was back then. And so it's important to remember how supportive and how helpful Meyerbeer was to Wagner. In any case, the production was picketed. And you know why it was picketed? Because Wagner put the ballet in the first act, and in Paris Grand Opera tradition, it has to be in the second act. So, any French people in the audience? Okay, well, I'm just going to say then as now. In any case, Wagner was stung a little bit by this, and Meyerbeer got on his enemy list. And one of the reasons was, of course, Meyerbeer is Jewish. And he saw Meyerbeer's outstanding success as an affront to his genius. So Wagner was not even appreciative of the people who helped him. Look at the way he treated Otto Wesendonck, look at the way he treated Giacomo Meyerbeer. In any case, what comes to his rescue is King Ludwig II of Bavaria. We find that Wagner's arrest warrant has been invalidated, so he can now return to Germany, which he does, under the patronage of Ludwig II. It's an interesting comparison to make now between the careers of Verdi and Wagner. Verdi did not rely on royal patronage, which was almost dead by this time anyway. But without it, I don't know that Wagner could ever have gotten The Ring finished and performed. King Ludwig II was, I think, head over heels in love with Wagner. And certainly he was a very sophisticated and informed enthusiast for Wagner's work. And so he wanted to see this Ring brought to its conclusion. And so he was willing to give Wagner a house and ultimately to contribute the most financially to the building of an opera house, which is called a Festspiel or festival house, to Wagner's own specifications. No other composer in history has had anything like that done for him or her. So that is ultimately what will happen. Wagner's back at home, he has a successful, sort of settled life, and we can now talk a little bit about The Ring and about what music drama is, because Wagner will now turn his back on any relationship that may have been discernible between his work and that of the great Italians, including Verdi. He didn't have very many kind words to say about Verdi, and I'm very happy to report that the reverse was not true. Verdi spoke very warmly and admiringly of Wagner's genius, and when he died, he said, "Don't make the mistake of saying that this was not a great composer or a great artist. He was just not Italian." And, and his feeling was that, that Italian composers should nourish and cultivate their own natural type of music, just like Germans had. He called himself a son of Palestrina, and he called Wagner a son of Bach, which I think is enormously perceptive. Now, back to Wagner, who was more self-absorbed than Verdi. He wanted to get away from the Italian prototype, in which, first of all, there was very often frivolous and sometimes even rather scandalous subject matter, and there was far too much focus on the technique and virtuosity of the singers. The orchestra provided what he described as a mere accompaniment, and even the structure of the work emphasized the singers receiving applause from the audience. So the succession of aria, applause, ensemble, applause, recitative to get the story told, another aria, applause, etc. He didn't want to have anything to do with that. So continuous melody was his response to the Italian method of having individual numbers. Now, when I say individual numbers, they had their own internal structure. They built to the climax, and they allowed the singer to sing a high note. They allowed the singer to show off all sorts of technical attributes, and then it finished, everyone clapped, and they went on. So to Wagner, what that meant was the music and the storytelling lurched from one thing to the next. So he wanted to do away with that. Now, in order to create this continuous melody, I've mentioned some of the techniques he used, an intense amount of chromaticism. So sometimes Wagner doesn't have the sort of access to harmonic movement that we've come to expect from a Mozart. But mind you, sometimes Mozart at his most experimental didn't have that either. He also uses a lot of deceptive cadences. Does somebody want me to illustrate what a deceptive cadence is? Okay. I feel that thing's going to collapse under my weight or something. Here was a perfect cadence, or a series of chords ending with a perfect cadence. You've all heard that series of chords many times and in many keys. Here's one called a plagal cadence. Now here's what a deceptive cadence can do. This is a very basic one. So that takes us somewhere unexpected. And Wagner has an almost uncountable variety of them in the Ring. So as we feel we're heading towards, say, a full stop in a sentence, Wagner keeps going and changes the key and therefore changes the harmonic direction. And if you can think of this, I think this is probably the most frequently quoted tune in the whole Ring, and it's in Die Walküre. otherwise known as Kill the Rabbit. That's often excerpted in orchestral concerts. And somebody pointed out the orchestral writing is so thick and so complete in and of itself that you can leave the Walküres at home. It's nice to have them along for the ride, but we don't need them. If we did that with Early Verdi, we'd be getting this without singing. Anyway, it's impossible to find a cadence to bring that to a close. Somebody has to change it because Wagner just keeps on going in different harmonic paths. Now, I want to mention something else that is more to do with the texture of the music. Do you all know the term counterpoint? Okay, I'm going to show you a texture that is not counterpoint, is not contrapuntal. This is a famous piece that I bet some of you have played. So that is, of course, an accompaniment. And Wagner does not do that very often. He would rather have two or more independent melodies of equal importance occurring at the same time. So his texture is highly contrapuntal. And that allows for one melody to be reaching a peak while another melody is coming to a logical conclusion. So they don't end at the same time. Therefore, there's no I should say, there are few points where all of the orchestra aligns at a full stop. Now, of course, there has to be a variety of length when it comes to sections, when it comes to phrases, just like there has to be when it comes to paragraphs and it comes to sentences. If you've read some of the more arcane academic writing, you'll remember having to read these in school or university where sometimes the first sentence coincides with the first paragraph. It's so long and it's so hard to pay attention to. Some of Wagner's detractors will say this is true of his music. It just takes a little bit of familiarity. Now, those are things that allow Wagner to create this feeling of continuous melody. I mentioned, I mentioned the word recitative. This is basically musicalized speech. And Wagner has many passages of recitative, but they're always accompanied by the orchestra. I don't think Wagner knew what a harpsichord was. But in order to tell the story, there are passages of recitative. There are also things that we can almost identify as arias that are sung by main characters. We sometimes have ensembles where we have several characters singing together. You get that with the Walküres, of course. And do you know what the Walküres say to each other? I'll show you when I get to the piano again. So the components that we associate so often with Italian opera are not really absent, it's just they've been translated into German. Now, we also have Wagner's allergy to the idea of being able to see the orchestra. This is for a number of reasons. Has anybody ever taken acting classes? So you know that teachers will always talk about subtext. What are you thinking about when you're saying something else? Like you're saying, gee, I like that plate of bacon and eggs, and you're thinking, I really want to slit my wrist. And so that's what we'll encounter with the orchestra in Wagner. To him, the orchestra represents the inner drama. What is the character really thinking of? What is the character being spoken to thinking of? And so it was important to him that that be subliminal, that we feel that in our subconscious, rather than see a bunch of musicians playing it. And remember, he had his hand in every aspect of production of his music dramas. And so one of the things he would have objected to as a scene designer and as a lighting designer was having all that white of the orchestra lights visible to the audience. So he will ultimately get rid of that in the one opera house designed to his specifications. He also, as I said, wanted to have elevated, didactic, instructive, edifying subject matters. And he wanted to take them from elements of Germanic history and mythology, which is where we get the Nibelungenlied. And he felt that a work of music drama must be a fusion of all the arts. So it's not just music. He felt that music and words, painting, philosophy, art, everything, movement, was subsumed into one art. And of course that meant that it had to be the product of one single ingenious creative mind, which was of course Wagner's. And this he called Gesamtkunstwerk, which means complete artwork. I think I'm just about ready to go back to the piano, if that's all right, and point out this now. There has to be structure in works that are even short, let alone long, like this one. And that comes very naturally if your opera is a series of independent numbers with dialogue or dry recitative in between. And what gives Wagner structure? And by that I mean this. There's basically two things you can do. Once you've played a note, you can either play it again or play something different. Those are your two choices. Of course, there's an infinity of possibilities contained within that. So there has to be things that we can recognize that'll come back. And so Wagner created what are called Leitmotifs. I think at this point I will head back to the piano. Have you heard that term before, the Leitmotif? Because a lot is made of it. It's not what Wagner called it at first. But these motives, first of all, to define that part of the word, a motive is essentially a fragment of a melody. And sometimes it will grow into a longer melody. Here's the most famous motive in all of Western music. And of course, Beethoven makes a melody out of that. Now, what the light or leading part of it is that each of these motives represents a character or an object or a state of mind or a place, something that a character can think about. And there are something like 158 independent leitmotifs in The Ring. And what is amazing about it is that they don't stay static. When a leitmotif comes back, it's often combined with another one. And it can be reorchestrated, and in some cases have different tempo or even slightly different rhythms. But because of the dramatic context, it takes on whole new colors. So they grow and develop throughout the course of the whole cycle, and throughout the course of just this one work, Die Walküre. So I thought at this point, I'm not going to play all 150 odd for you. For those of you who are really interested, and you can find this on YouTube, I think. I actually own a CD. Do you remember that technology? Do you remember LPs, anybody? Well, in the first release, the first LP release of The Ring was conducted by Sir Georg Scholti. And a fellow named Derek Cook put together a kind of like educational component or adjunct to it, which explained all of the leitmotifs. And it's on 2 CDs, you can get it. It's actually, it's terrific and educational. Nothing replaces the experience of hearing them within the context of the whole work, but you'll just have a little bit of familiarity. So maybe go online and see if there's somebody there. Look up leitmotifs on YouTube or something. So I'm going to play you the first one, but I'll tell you a little bit of the story. Okay, I won't just give you a whole plot synopsis, but I have to tell you a few things about it. I guess I'm asking this question first. Was anybody at our Rheingold 10 years ago? Oh, good. A gratifying number of you said yes. It does help to have a look at that because it sets it up. That's what a prelude is supposed to do. But it introduces you to basically the leading character of this piece. It's named after one of the Valkyries, but the leading character really is her father, Wotan, the big kahuna of gods, the one who sees everything. And in order to obtain the ability to see everything that is, that will be, that ever was, he had to give up one of his actual physical eyes. So that's why we see Wotan with an eye patch. And he walks everywhere with a spear, and engraved in the spear are all the contracts he'd made. And they have become more and more unscrupulous and unethical. So Wotan is a very flawed god. He's a god with feet of clay. And actually, among the gods, the solidest one is his wife Fricka, who is the goddess of domestic felicity or marriage. She's so strong in her beliefs and so invincible that she can be a little irritating, but she's not wrong. Anyway, Wotan, now this is where he might resemble his creator a little bit, has not been a model of marital fidelity at all. So the Valkyries of the title are daughters that he sired with the earth goddess Erda. I'll tell you their names in a second because we don't meet them at first. We meet the twin son and daughter that he had with a mortal woman. So the guy gets around. And the twins were separated at birth and have no idea that the other exists. And their names are Siegmund and Sieglinde. And as the work opens, Siegmund is caught in a terrible sort of battle with some barbarians in the forest, and he is robbed of his sword and thus has to flee. And he finds himself in a hut one of the laws, one of the codes of honor in the forest is that if a stranger requires rest and sustenance, you have to give it to that person. And so he is in the hut occupied by his twin sister Sieglinde and her barbarian husband Hunding. So already it hasn't even started and it's fun. And so what will result eventually, of course, is that Siegmund and Sieglinde feel a very, very strong bond instantly, spiritual and physical. And Hunding is no fool. He's a barbarian, but he's smart. And he knows something weird is happening. He has identified this guy, this stranger in his house, as the enemy of his people. And so he says, yes, the code of honor of the forest demands that I give him rest and sustenance and hospitality. But tomorrow we're going to fight it out. Now Siegmund knows that his father has put a sword somewhere when he will most need it. So the sword is in fact buried in a tree outside of the hut, and no one has ever been able to extricate it. So that power will, of course, be given to Siegmund. So here is a motive that is identified with the sword. This is a really good motive to begin with because it's very much nothing but a C major triad. But it's memorable. That's all it is. And he doesn't say anything while that's being played. And he has said before, a sword my father foretold me would serve me in sorest need, and because he has had his sword stolen from him. And so that will be heard many times. And throughout this, we have his monologue. And I'm going to read just this one stage direction Wagner gives us, because remember, he put tons of stage directions in. He is the creative genius that this Gesamtkunstwerk can be credited to. He writes, "The fire falls together from the flame," and he would have expected an actual flame, and lots of them in this work, "from the flame which springs up a bright light, strikes on the spot in the ash, indicated by Sieglinde's look, on which a sword hilt is now clearly visible." So that's one of the motives. Now I want to play one that's derived from a kind of love motive that is given to us. It's very beautiful. And this is when Sieglinde cannot hold her passion in anymore. He says, "You are the spring." And they realize that they are sort of bound to be together. This is something that is excerpted often as an aria, "Du bist der Lenz." Etc. It's impossible to play the orchestra and the voice part at the same time because the orchestra is always so busy. But you'll get to hear that sung, and it'll be thrilling, I promise you. So going on, I'm getting to here we go. This is the most famous of them, and this is derived from the most famous, I should say. So Sieglinde and Siegmund will, of course, hook up, as we might say today. Sieglinde even puts a sleeping potion in her husband's drink to get him out of the picture. And of course, ultimately, this will produce a child. Now, you should read what the English critics of the 1870s had to say about that. Incest! Adultery! So it took a while for them to get over this. They have. In any case, that's what's going to happen. And of course, there's going to be this fight to the death the next morning. And so we now meet Wotan and his wife Fricka and his favorite daughter. And he is about to send his favorite daughter, whose name is Brunhilde, to make sure, because she's divine, that Siegmund, his son, wins the fight. And then Fricka intervenes. And she uses all her power, which is considerable, to make sure that the rightful husband of Sieglinde is the victor in this fight. So Hunding must win. And Brunhilde is in a very, very difficult position because she knows her father's heart, but she also has now been instructed by her father to make sure that Hunding wins. So this is the music that Brunhilde sings when she's summoned by her father to receive these orders. Then that is sung to the words Hoya to ho. How about a nice big chorus? Hoya to ho! Everybody, 1, 2. Hoya to ho! Okay, you can be honorary Valkyries now. And one of my favorite parlor games, well, remember when we were kids, we used to try to remember the names of all 7 dwarfs? So let's learn all the names of the Valkyries. I think I need my glasses for this. So Brunhilde is the favorite daughter and the leading Valkyrie, and the opera is named after her. But her sisters are Gerhilde, Ortlinde, Waltraute, Schwertleite, Helmwige, Sigrune, Grimgerde, and Rossweisse. Don't name any of your children any of those names. And of course, very famously, I think that's the next one I wanted to play. Oh no, there's a better one. Yeah. Brunhilde, of course, will come face to face with Siegmund. So a divinity will come face to face with a mortal, even though they share the same father. This is a long time before Freud. But in any case, we have 2 motives that are going to permeate a great deal of this music. The first one is tied to fate. I have to find the right clef. Here we go. Sorry, I got it wrong. Here it is again. So just those notes you're going to hear, dee-da-dum, especially in the all-important last scene. That's a fate motive. And then we have this one. Let's remind myself what it is. This one is, to underscore the significance of the moment, Wagner uses what are called Wagner tubas, an instrument, well, you know what a tuba is, an instrument he sort of recreated to suit his purposes. And the fate motive, which I'm about to play now, is the second important one, and we hear it throughout the opera. So rather grim and foreboding. Now, what happens is that Brunhilde, because of her tremendous love for her father, feels that she has to do what she knows he wants her to do in his heart. And so she ensures that Hunding is slain rather than Siegmund. But her father comes along. Why he just didn't do it himself in the first place, I don't know. But he thwarts his daughter and ensures that Siegmund is killed, and then looks at Hunding with contempt and kills him too. And at this point, Sieglinde has to get herself away. She has to escape, and Brunhilde feels she must help her. And Brunhilde must help her because she knows, being divine, that Sieglinde is carrying a baby who will one day be a great hero. And that, of course, will be somebody called Siegfried. And that's the name of the next work in the tetralogy. Now, everybody wants to hear this. And this is the beginning of Act 3. And all of the sisters of Brunhilde are gathering together to do what they do best, which is to pick up dead bodies from battlefields. Pick up the fallen soldiers who will then be taken to Valhalla, the home of the gods, to guard and help them be secure because of Wotan's unethical businesses on Earth and because of the theft of the gold. He now has had to build this fortress to protect the gods from their natural predators. So here we have the Valkyries, and that's what they're doing whenever you hear this. That's what they're doing, picking up dead bodies. How do I do this? Yeah. And that's just the orchestra part. It's really very thrilling. And then the Valkyries come on and start, well, Pierre Boulez described them as body snatchers who screech like hyenas. That's not really fair, but it is kind of French. But he did conduct it extremely well. So now we have a couple of more motives that I'd like to show you before we get to the end. Now, of course, Brunhilde is in big trouble. And a very, very perceptive line said by Wotan is, he refers to the hero who will rescue Brunhilde, and this is a bit premature, but he says, somebody who has more freedom than a god. In other words, a mortal may have less power and may be mortal, but they have more freedom than a god. A royal or a god is subject to certain codes of behavior, and he cannot forgive his daughter for disobeying him. He's the head god. And so he is going to have to punish Brunhilde, and therefore Sieglinde is about to lose what she feels is her only protector. What happens is that Brunhilde gives her the broken bit of the sword, and that protects her. But that's a little detail you can find out when you go to the opera. So this is the Siegfried motive that I'm about to play, and then a love motive that will only be heard once more in the ring. So the Siegfried motive is when Brunhilde says, the baby you're carrying, Sieglinde has said, I might as well just die. No. The baby you're carrying will grow up to be a great hero. And this is the melody. That is also the melody that accompanies the last line of words in the entire work. And I'm going to tell you a little story about that. Back in 1927, which was before I was born, there was the first Best Picture Oscar winner, the movie called Wings, which is set in the First World War. And there was a lot of air battles in that movie. It's worth seeing just for that. And whenever a German plane entered the picture, that's what they played. Because I guess they felt confident in 1927. Everybody would associate that with the Germans. And now, following that is this music representing love and the redemptive power of love. It's sung by Sieglinde. All right. Now, that melody is heard once more, and that is at the end of Götterdämmerung, the end of the entire ring. That melody comes back. And Sieglinde, of course, will have her baby and then die. Now, the scene that follows is filled with motives. I'm going to play you some of them. And this is the scene where Wotan has to say goodbye to Brunhilde. And what he's done is he's decided he's going to take away her immortality and her divinity. With a kiss to the forehead, he can do that. And then put her to sleep. And in the middle of the forest, there she will be, asleep, defenseless, and vulnerable, so that the first creature who wakes her up can have her. So Brunhilde appeals to him and reminds him of all the wonderful things they've done together and how faithful she's been and how close they've been. And so she beseeches him to at least create something so that the person who rescues her will be worthy of her. And so he summons the god of fire, Loge, and he decides to encircle his daughter in a ring of fire. Whenever I have to say that, I say, thanks a lot, Johnny Cash. Because that's one of the things that makes Die Walküre expensive to mount, because it has to have some fire around it. And therefore, whoever rescues her has to be able to get through that ring of fire. So he has to be pretty determined. So, this is a motive associated with the pain of love and the pain of saying goodbye. And it starts off this whole fantastic scene where Wotan has to say goodbye to Brunhilde. So just that little scale. We'll come back. It's so gloriously romantic, that music, and so warmly played. And it gives way to something called slumber motive, which I've got here somewhere. Oh, I'll just play it. Just that over and over again is associated with the peaceful slumber that Brunhilde can now go into because she knows that she's going to be rescued by someone worthy of her. Now, all of this warmth, this beauty, I think there's even the motive that's given to the magic sleep. So she sinks with her eyes closed into sleep. So there's slumber and there's magic sleep. And then when Wotan summons Loge, we get his spear motive. And the spear motive is actually quite violent. You can tell, listening to this, that this guy means business and probably not always really good business. So that's very, like pounding a spear into the floor. And it's followed immediately by this wispy kind of chromatic music, which is associated with Loge. And he's a Loge, Lascia here, come to me. And he orders Loge to make a fire. Now, I want to say one thing about Loge. I should just talk into the mic. It's better, isn't it? Loge has been created by Wotan, and he's one, I was going to say person, he's one character who doesn't really trust. He doesn't really trust Wotan. He doesn't go along with all this building of Valhalla and stuff like that. He manages to keep himself a little bit aloof. So he comes, or I don't think we see him. He just is there. And fire starts springing up. And we have magic fire music. Now, that mingles with the slumber, it mingles with the whole idea of the magic sleep, and finally culminates with the last line that is sung in the opera, which is Wotan addresses his spear and says, "Whosoever fears the tip of my spear will never penetrate that ring of fire." And the melody, of course, is this. And then the rest of the music is a culmination of the motives as the fire continues to burn and the curtain comes down. I'm going to just say one little practical thing. I always feel a bit sorry for the Wotan. He sings a lot in this piece. He has long monologues. This final scene is essentially Wotan's monologue. It's about 17 minutes long. Well, okay, she sings a little bit, but once she's put to sleep, he sings and sings and sings. He says goodbye to her. And the interesting thing is at the end there, he's got to hunk out high Fs and high Es. It's a difficult role. We need those Wagner singers. Now, I want to say a little bit about the hall, about the house. This is in the southern German city of Bayreuth. And it's now called the Bayreuth, or the Wagner Festspielhaus Bayreuth. And it only produces Wagner's works, and it only produces them from the Flying Dutchman on. He refused to allow Rienzi ever to be put in it, and everybody has honored his wishes, to the best of my knowledge. It's basically built, as I said, to his own specifications. And I believe one of them is that cushioning has a deadening effect on sound. So it's not the most comfortable opera house by everything I've heard. And it also has a rule. I don't know whether Wagner had anything to do with this, but you have to be in your seat 5 minutes before showtime. The doors lock at that point and no one's allowed in. And I remember reading about this poor couple. They'd come all the way from New Zealand and their train was a bit late. So they got there 4 minutes before curtain time. And they had to miss all of Das Rheingold because there's no intermission. So everything I said about the French now, we can say that's so German. So the one thing about it that is astounding, Timothy has said it has the most incredible acoustics. So let's just take that for granted. But the orchestra, of course, as you will have read, is underneath the stage in 3 or 4 tiers. So they cannot be seen by the audience. The conductor sort of occupies this position so they can see the conductor and the singers can see the conductor. And he said you sit in the house and you're not sure where the music's coming from. It just is there, which must be really magical. So we cannot reproduce that, nor can we reproduce the actual orchestra because there's so many people in that orchestra. It has something like 36 wind and brass players, 16 first violins, 16 second violins. So we don't have any room for that in our pit. Are you aware of the cage, by the way, you Royal Theatre? No one's told you about the cage? Okay, I'm going to. It's not as forbidding as it might sound, but there is this space in the loading bay that's sort of has wire mesh, and that's where we can put percussion instruments. I've played in there, in the organ part of Daphne back in 2007. It was great, Ian, because I had about 3 minutes worth of music, and so then I could go home. But that is then electronically transmitted into the hall. And unless you're in the front row, which you can usually hear that there's some disconnect between the sounds, once you're back a few rows, it sounds like they're there. So it enables us to produce works like this, but still we have to use an orchestral reduction. And the one we're using was composed during Wagner's own lifetime. He heard it and apparently approved of it. Thank you. And it means that the work can be produced in smaller opera houses as well. So it's been produced in Europe for over 100 years. And it will give you the feeling, it's an ingenious scoring. It will give you the feeling of sweep and of majesty, but also detail. And so Timothy's put together a really wonderful cast. I think all 3 of the male singers, the Siegmund, the Hunding, and the Wotan, are new to Pacific Opera, but most of the women you'll have heard of before. I want to make one special mention of Jennifer Maines, who sang Madame Butterfly with us in 1999, and then the role of Katharina in The Taming of the Shrew in 2001. And since then, she has been singing in Innsbruck. She's one of their leading artists there. And that's under the directorship of the great German mezzo-soprano Brigitte Fassbaender. Has anyone heard of Brigitte? And she has been a kind of mentor to Jennifer. So long before COVID, when Timothy first wanted to put this opera on, I keep calling it an opera. I should say music drama. When he wanted to put this on, he called her and asked her if she thought she might consider playing Brunhilde. It's not quite so forbidding in a smaller house. And she said, you'll never guess what. Just a week ago, Brigitte Fassbaender called me into her office and said, Jen, it's time for you to do Brunhilde. So she's doing this with Madame Fassbaender's approval. So that's a little bit about Walküre. And Timothy put this perfectly when he was here yesterday. He said, we have so much information about what a scoundrel-like character Wagner was. I have a little anecdote I want to share. He was hosting a dinner party, and when he put his fork down, like when the Queen put her fork down, everyone else had to stop eating. And he said, my friends, it is time to talk about death. Yes, even so great a man as I must die. And he took them around to show them. He designed his own mausoleum in his backyard with a little one for his dog. That humanizes him a little bit. Anyway, there's a lot a lot of resources if you'd care to look for those leitmotifs. I would recommend that if you'd like to get to know a little bit more about this work. If it's your first Wagner, that's a good idea, but even if you don't have time to do that, just let the music happen, let the thing happen to you. Just go in there and give yourself up to it. I think that's probably the best way to enjoy Wagner in the early days of your relationship with him. But I know you're going to enjoy it, I know. And it's really an amazing thing that we can say we saw Wagner's Die Walküre in Victoria, BC. 43 years ago, they wouldn't have imagined this would happen. 43 years ago, they laughed at us for having an opera in the first place in Victoria. Why? You got Vancouver. Why you need one in Victoria? Nobody thought we'd ever produce Strauss operas or anything like that, or Berg's Wozzeck. So here we are, Victoria. We're surprising the world yet again. So come and enjoy Walküre. And keep in mind that when we did the Birds, people came for the first performance, and some people actually went and bought tickets for the remaining 4. So who knows? That might happen again. But let's aim for a sold-out Walküre in Victoria, BC at the Royal Theatre. Thank you so much for being here. I'll look forward to seeing you again, and enjoy the rest of your beautiful weekend. Bye.